Okay, just imagine this for a second. Imagine you're running one of the most powerful, self-sufficient civilizations on the planet, and then another country shows up and starts forcing drugs on your people. I'm not talking about some rogue smugglers. I'm talking about it being official government policy. And when you try and stop them, they declare war. On you. Twice. This isn't some wild sci-fi plot. This is the very real story of Britain and China in the 1800s. It sounds absolutely insane when you put it that way, doesn't it? But this one question right here is the key to this whole story. It gets to the heart of the moral stakes and helps you understand how a trade dispute could spiral into one of the most unjust conflicts in modern history. So to see how this all went down, you've got to look at the two empires at the center of it all. First, you've got Qing Dynasty China. It's a powerhouse, completely self-sufficient. They've got tea, silk, porcelain, you name it, they make the best of it. They looked at the stuff Britain was making and were, frankly, unimpressed. And then you have Britain, an empire with a massive, massive addiction to Chinese tea. The whole country was obsessed. But China didn't want anything Britain was selling, and that created this huge fundamental imbalance. And that imbalance leads us right into part one, Britain's silver problem. And look, this wasn't some minor accounting issue. This was a full-blown national economic crisis, and it was all because of their love for a good cup of tea. See, China held all the cards here. Britain desperately wanted its luxury goods, but China just wasn't interested in British products. So they would only accept one thing in payment: pure silver. Now, if you're an empire that believes your national wealth is literally how much silver and gold you have stacked up, this is a total disaster. And to make sure they stayed in control, China restricted all foreign trade to one single port, Canton. So yeah, China was calling all the shots. And the scale of this problem? It was staggering. Every single year, Britain was shipping around 2 million ounces of silver to China. It was an unsustainable hemorrhage of wealth. The way the British saw it, their national power was literally sailing away on ships, headed for another country. The economy was straining, and they knew they had to do something. They needed to find a product, anything, that China would actually want to buy, just to stop this catastrophic bleeding of silver. And this is where the story takes a really dark turn. Because Britain found its solution. It wasn't some clever new invention or a popular fabric. It was a highly addictive drug, opium. This was a truly cynical solution, because opium isn't something you just want. It's something your body begins to need. Once you're hooked, the withdrawal is so agonizing that you'll do almost anything to get more. Opium basically creates its own demand. The drug itself is the marketing. And Britain realized they had finally found a product that China just couldn't say no to. And they didn't just stumble upon this. No, this was a systematic, state-sponsored operation. The British East India Company forced farmers in India to grow opium, turning it into a massive industry. But here's the really sneaky part. The British government didn't sell it directly to China because opium was already illegal there. Instead, they sold it to private smugglers who then flooded the Chinese market. It gave them plausible deniability while they ran the biggest, most profitable drug cartel in history. And all that drug money? It funded a huge chunk of their colonial budget in India.
The results for China were just catastrophic. I mean, look at this. In 1800, around 4,000 chests of opium were smuggled in. Less than 40 years later, that number had exploded by 10 times to 40,000 chests, each one holding over 100 pounds of opium. That silver problem Britain had? Oh, it was solved. The flow of silver completely reversed, and now it was pouring out of China and into British hands. The social cost, though, was unimaginable.
By the late 1830s, China was facing a full-blown crisis. Millions were addicted. The economy was in shambles. The emperor, completely desperate, turned to one man he knew was incorruptible, a man named Commissioner Lin Zexu. His mission was simple: end the opium trade. For good. Before he used force, Commissioner Lin tried diplomacy. He wrote this incredibly powerful letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her basic sense of right and wrong. The logic is it's devastatingly simple. He's basically saying, you've banned this drug in your own country because you know it's poison, so how can you justify selling it to mine? He was just asking her to imagine if the roles were reversed. It's such a clear, profound moral argument.
And the response? Nothing. Crickets. Complete silence. We don't know for sure if the Queen ever even saw the letter, but the British government's position was crystal clear. Their profits were more important than morality.
Lin's appeal to simple human decency was just ignored. So, realizing diplomacy was a dead end, Lin took action. He blockaded the foreign traders in Canton and demanded they hand over every last bit of their opium. They did. They surrendered over 1,400 tons of the drug. And for 23 days, Lin staged this massive public event, mixing the opium with salt and lime and washing it all out to sea. It was a huge, powerful statement. This poison is not welcome here. So how did Britain respond to what was essentially the world's largest drug bust? They sent warships. Let that sink in for a minute. Great Britain declared war on China because China had the nerve to confiscate illegal drugs. Of course, they didn't call it the Opium War. No, they framed it as a defense of free trade and British honor. But, not everyone in Britain was buying that story. William Gladstone, a young politician who would later become prime minister, actually stood up in Parliament and called this war out for exactly what it was, an absolute disgrace. He knew it was about protecting a disgusting drug trade, but his voice was pretty much drowned out by all the people getting rich from it. The war itself, well, it was less of a war and more of a massacre. You had Britain's brand new industrial age military with its steam-powered gunboats and modern cannons going up against China's traditional fleet of wooden sailing ships and outdated artillery. The Chinese soldiers fought with incredible bravery, but courage can't stop an exploding cannon shell. It was like bringing a sword to a naval bombardment. After being defeated, China was forced to sign what became known as the first of the Unequal treaties. The terms were just deeply humiliating. China had to pay reparations, and get this, that included money to compensate the British for the very opium that they had destroyed. They were forced to open 5 of their ports, basically losing control of their own trade. They had to hand over the island of Hong Kong to Britain forever, and they had to grant British citizens immunity from Chinese laws. It was a total punishment for daring to protect its own people. And it didn't even stop there. A second Opium War broke out a few years later. In 1860, British and French troops marched on Beijing, and there they looted and then burned the magnificent old summer palace to the ground. It was this incredible treasure trove of centuries of Chinese art and culture just gone. The famous author Victor Hugo called it what it was, an act of barbarism committed by so-called civilized nations. It was pure cultural vandalism. The Opium Wars kicked off a period that in China is now known as its century of humiliation. And the consequences of these defeats weren't just short-term. No, they would echo for generations and completely reshape the country. Seriously, to understand modern China, you have to understand this concept. This century of humiliation is this deep, collective national memory of a time when the country was powerless, carved up by foreign empires, and totally unable to control its own destiny. And it all started right here, with Britain forcing opium on them at the barrel of a gun. And the opium trade, which was now legal, just spiraled completely out of control. By the late 1800s, some estimates suggest that as much as 40% of the adult male population was addicted. Think about that. This wasn't some fringe issue. It was a societal plague that completely hollowed out communities, destroyed families, and crippled the entire nation. This defeat triggered a complete cascade of disasters. The Qing Dynasty, bankrupt and totally discredited, finally collapsed. And when other powers like Russia and France saw how weak China was, they rushed in to carve out their own pieces of the country. This led to horrific internal conflicts like the Taiping Rebellion, which killed tens of millions of people. And to top it all off, a newly modernized Japan easily defeated China in another war, taking control of Taiwan. It was one disaster after another. Which brings us to this final question. The Opium Wars were never just about tea or silver. They were about one powerful nation profiting directly from the forced suffering and degradation of another. And understanding that history, that deep, painful wound, is absolutely essential to understanding not just the past, but the world we live in right now. It's a sobering reminder of how power, profit, and memory can collide in the most devastating ways.